Do you remember the days of these being a regular staple in our everyday lives as kids? Print magazines used to be such an exciting thing. They could be the cure for boredom, a reprieve while your parents shopped, or they could be the one incentive needed to check the mail when asked to do so. Before the internet became the one-stop shop, it's cool to look back on magazines like these to see how their publishers balance entertaining us, informing us, trying to sell us stuff, and the ultimate parental approval for any kid's magazine, the requirement to educate us. These magazines are just some of those that instantly came to mind from my 90s adolescence. So let's take a look and discuss. First up, we have Nickelodeon Magazine. I rarely saw this out in the wild as a kid, but I do remember its commercial.
Nickelodeon Magazine, please.
As the commercial so poetically described, Nickelodeon Magazine was full of celebrity interviews, comics, puzzles, and tons of things to collect. Its first two issues were released as Pizza Hut exclusives in 1990, with regular publication beginning in the summer of 1993 with the classic Ren and Stimpy swimsuit edition. The magazine would have a long run until its cancellation in 2009. This is the November 1998 issue promoting the first Rugrats movie. Every issue tended to have its own theme, and this one was a Farm Fresh issue, with farm-related material popping up in their celebrity interviews, comics, and in other features throughout about different kinds of farms and farm-adjacent content, like these large farm objects found throughout the United States. There was always one exclusive interview with a celebrity, in this case it was Adam Sandler. Some of the recurring items were the magazine's mascot, this cute terrier dog named Zelda Van Gutters. She pops up in Where's Waldo fashion in different spots to give witty commentary on certain sections. Towards the back there's this very memorable and popular comic section. The comics featured underground artists of the time, and also at least one comic based on a Nickelodeon cartoon, like this one with the Angry Beavers. Ooze News kept you up to date on all things Nickelodeon. Whatever You Want included different contests for kids, and Revolting But True Facts delivered on its title with its uniquely rubber hose style animation. And that's just some of the regular sections. Each page pings back and forth between entertainment and education so much that it intentionally feels a little disorganized and chaotic. But it's pretty fitting given what Nickelodeon's personality was in the 90s. As far as the physical quality of this magazine, I love it. The texture of the paper is so nice to turn and hold. Just listen. And the comics feel like newspaper, so it feels like you're reading the Sunday Funnies, making this entire section feel like a bonus to the rest of the magazine. Nickelodeon Magazine is witty and humorous in ways that can be both informative while retaining that slick 90s Nickelodeon humor. I always found Nickelodeon's brand to be a bit edgy for parents' taste, but this magazine manages to avoid being too over the top, being able to educate while giving the impression that the kid is sort of left in charge to read it. After all, if you look at this order slip that comes in the magazine, you of course have to address it to the kid and just get your parent's signature down there, kind of like as if they're co-signing for a loan or something. As the commercial promised, there are things to collect. In this issue, we are provided with some Thanksgiving dinner place cards and a regular monthly calendar that you could always cut out. So tell me, what was your favorite thing about Nickelodeon Magazine? And did you get 6 issues for only $9.97? One down. Speaking of Nickelodeon and its commercials, remember this one?
No other collection gives you the feeling of pure moods.
Okay, I'm just kidding, not that one. I've already made a video on the language learning program for kids, Muzzy, but if I had to pick at random another nostalgic commercial that aired on Nickelodeon to talk about, then it has to be...
You can get 12 fascinating issues of zoobooks for the special price of $19.95.
Was there a better gateway to wildlife photography for kids than zoobooks? Founded by Wildlife Education Limited back in 1980, this magazine was later acquired by Ranger Rick in the 20-teens and is still in some form of publication today. This was always simplicity at its most effective. Each issue featured one species with a simple title and that familiar rainbow logo on top. As you can imagine, this was a purely educational magazine with no advertisements whatsoever, chock full of information, diagrams, illustrations, and like I already mentioned, wonderful nature photography. While you could order this as a subscription, this was a go-to for doctor or dentist waiting room visits, but zoobooks popped up in a lot of places given their safe educational nature. Pun intended. As you can see, I bought a bunch of these, but the one I think I want to show off is the one I remember being the most in demand. Big cats. I blame Lion King fever. Again, the strongest pull here is the pictures, especially the large spread photos for those who preferred only looking to reading. The skeletal and muscle diagrams of the animals were always a bit frightening, but I suppose sometimes there's no sugarcoating quality zoological education. I really love the matte finish on these. It really bolsters the quality of the images, and it keeps the magazine in a pretty good preserved state. From these lovely write-ups in the beginning, to the illustrations of different breeds and factoids spread throughout, it's got a lot to just admire and gaze at in what is not a very thick magazine by any means. I also like the last page titled The Future On that gives you info on how you can take conservatory action to protect the wildlife featured. Except for the spider issue for some reason. Either spiders aren't in any trouble, or like most people I know, this is their quiet way of saying, yeah, I hate spiders, but you know, have fun learning about them. Which issue of zoobooks did you absolutely have to have growing up? Next, we have Disney Adventures. This is the May 1996 issue promoting the film James and the Giant Peach, where you probably recall seeing these the most were next to the tabloids and other magazines in the checkout aisle at the grocery store. I love the size of it. It just reminds me of TV Guide and Reader's Digest. Having not read this much when I was younger, the first thing I noticed is that there's a lot crammed onto its tiny pages, with half of it just being advertisements in the beginning. The text is very small and things are arranged in an unorganized way that makes it a tough read sometimes, and not in the pleasant way that Nickelodeon Magazine pulled it off. There are some features asking kids which artists and fashions are hot and which are not, some dessert recipes mailed in by kids in their very hip zip code section, and then there's this calendar that breaks my eyes to read. I know it's mostly harmless, fun information, but there's not a lot of substance in these first few pages, in my opinion. But don't worry, I'm not going to be completely sour on Disney Adventures. Created by Disney exec Michael Linton back in 1990, Disney Adventures' main priority was to promote the Disney Afternoon TV programming block. Its first issue was a Halloween cover featuring Baloo from the animated series Tailspin and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids star Rick Moranis. The magazine starts to hit its stride around the midpoint, showing off some in-detail production of James and the Giant Peach, but the coolest section has to be the Adventure Files, which showcases a guy nicknamed Mr. Adventure going off on cool extreme adventures. In this case, tree climbing that I found to be a pretty fun read. This magazine also had a comic section that, like Nickelodeon, was well received and featured smaller artists, including a short run of the series Bone by Jeff Smith that would later become popular. Its comic section would even be headed for a while by legendary comic book writer Marv Wolfman, but what I appreciate the most is that there's a section for kids to submit their own comics, with a select few getting featured in the magazine. After all, like Nickelodeon, this was supposed to be for us. I think there's no questioning that Nickelodeon's production value was much higher than Disney Adventures. Both feature materials unrelated to Nickelodeon and Disney properties at the time, while continuing to promote their respective brands. But just by the sheer amount of Disney VHS promos thrown in here from back in those Disney Vault days, I'd say Disney was just fine with this magazine being majority promotional. But even though it takes some flipping through to find some meat on these bones, they still have some good stuff in it nonetheless. Do you agree or disagree? Am I being too tough on Disney Adventures, or am I spot on? And how does it compare to Nickelodeon? Speaking of magazines full of shameless advertising, Nintendo Power. At least for this era of the magazine, which is the November 1998 The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time issue, this was not as great as I remember. And the reason I say that is because the Nintendo 64, which was Nintendo's main console at the time, was putting out a pretty weak library. And no, I'm not talking about one of the greatest games ever made, but what you'll notice when flipping through this magazine is that for every great Nintendo 64 title, there were at least 3 completely forgettable titles. But Nintendo Power's main purpose was to give a glimpse at new Nintendo products, offering a peek at gameplay, and includes essentially a micro-strategy guide to get started, and ultimately push you to buy their stuff. Nintendo Power first debuted with its July-August 1988 issue. The first issue featured clay versions of Super Mario Bros. Characters, and was reimagined again for the final cover in 2012. Unlike other entertainment magazines I've covered that didn't shy from featuring unrelated properties, Nintendo Power was only Nintendo and was heavy on praising and rarely criticizing any new Nintendo products, playing on our devoted Nintendo fanboy tendencies to buy their stuff even if it was garbage. But there are still some sections that hold up that I fondly remember. Player's Pulse and the power charts were the first sections I always hit. I loved the envelope artwork and snippets readers would send in, making it feel like a very cool community you were a part of. The power charts were even more enticing, showing which games for each Nintendo console held the top 10 spots. Below, the most wanted section teased yet to be released games and consoles people wanted the most. Like I said, the bulk of the issue features new and upcoming games, and depending if you were invested in the game or not, determined whether it was worth diving into the beautiful map layouts and tips scattered across the pages, which was always a treat to look at even if you lacked interest. Once you get past the ads and the filler, the issue wraps up nicely with the now playing section, a succinct rating summary for each game featured in the issue, and as I mentioned, most games were treated way too kindly. And if you so happen to be bored with what you were being sold, you could still get one of these to poorly tape to your bedroom door with all of its magnificent creases. I gotta say, the creases really make it pop. Nintendo Power is not the classic I remembered, but I also didn't get as great of an era compared to others from Nintendo. So is there anyone out there that might remember Nintendo Power from the Super Nintendo or Wii era? I would love to know how the 64 era of Nintendo Power compared to those. Now for our oldest entry, highlights. If I had to pick an image that I instantly associate with highlights, it would be this thing. Highlights was created by child development experts and couple Caroline C. Myers and Gary C. Myers back in 1946 in quaint Honesdale, Pennsylvania, where its editorial offices are still headquartered today. Within its first 4 years though, the magazine was at risk of going under until the Myers son came up with a great idea: sell subscriptions to the offices of doctors and dentists. Hence why no pediatrician office was complete without a mess of these scattered in the play area of the waiting room. This is definitely the most wholesome of the group of magazines I'm covering today, as Highlights has no advertising and is specially curated to children's learning and education, featuring short stories, riddles, poetry, and its most famous feature, the hidden pictures. Highlights is a magazine that aims to entertain kids by using their own critical thinking. This is the October 1998 issue. As you can see, the issues always featured a very colorful illustrated cover depicting children and oftentimes nature. If we flip inside, you'll notice that it has sort of a construction paper consistency, making it feel okay to kind of be more hands-on and scribble inside of it, which we often did. Each issue featured 2 sections, special to this issue and regular features. The special section included original fictional short stories. In other stories, you could interactively act out the narrative, like this one with a ghost puppet. Then there are just more general educational materials. The regular features, of course, had plenty of different hidden picture sections that were always the place you go to first, but there's also a cool section where kids send questions about dinosaurs to this dude, Dino Don, a regular comic that goes back to Highlights' early days, starring polar opposite kids, Goofus and Gallant, and even a section that helps you make different things. Highlights magazine has always steered clear of controversy, politics, any news that could be considered frightening, and apparently unsavory angles, as some illustrators have been instructed to not get too close to any crotch areas in their drawings, basically eliminating anything that could be considered remotely edgy or too suggestive. Their methods tend to want to preserve the innocence of children, though they did once have to address a request from a child asking about same-sex parents, which did draw ire from a conservative organization of mothers. And depending on your own personal philosophy regarding the education of kids from the ages of 6 to 12, you may or may not agree with just how real magazines like these should get with kids. I love Highlights, and I appreciate the large amount of stories included and the care taken in their beautiful illustrations. It does stay firmly in the age range and is pretty devoid of any overly witty material, but it's a proactive magazine that always left me feeling motivated to do something instead of just absorbing information. So what was your favorite part about Highlights? I'm kidding, I know it's the hidden pictures, alright? Finally, I wanted to segue from Highlights into this final magazine because of that previous question I posed about how much you should expose kids to the real world in order to educate them. Well, Time for Kids definitely might just be everything Highlights was missing in terms of that sort of exposure. Time for Kids was of course a spin-off of its parent magazine, Time, that originally came in these micro-thin issues handed out in schools. I bought a bunch of issues from the year 2000 that I definitely recall reading on Friday afternoons in the 6th grade. Of all the magazines I've covered today, these have been the most enjoyable to revisit. When it came to contemporary news about the world, science, history, politics, and major events, Time for Kids was an easy, comprehensible entry to these sort of issues for relatively obvious reasons. First off, these things are super light with little to no fat on filler news. They give enough variety without overdoing it or boring you, and more importantly, they don't patronize you in the way they deliver and discuss the nature of the topics. The excellent Kids Talk Back section allowed kids to voice their opinions about stories from previous issues, giving kids a great format to make their own decisions according to the information that was given without overwhelming them. The other day, my friend mentioned that Time for Kids was the place he first learned about the oil industry and global climate effects. And I remember reading these and feeling way more grown up, feeling like I had earned the right to learn about real and important things going on in our world. The occasional cherry on top with Time for Kids, though, was the back page. Where you expect a generic ad on the back of the magazine, you're given a little extra with Time for Kids. I love the mystery character you had to guess that would be answered in the subsequent issue, and typically these were always just feel-good snippets that left you on a high note, no matter how serious or morose the material on the inside got. The final thing I'll say is that it's kind of cool to look back at this particular magazine as sort of an introduction to world news for kids, whereas today there's no real introduction phase. Now, news in any shape or form is sort of built in with the technology that surrounds us. As the information age can suck us in and allow us to learn more at a time, I just find it interesting that this was the standard for how much news at one time was appropriate for the innocent minds of kids to take in. But what do you think? Was Time for Kids the way to go for introducing you to contemporary world news? Or did you just skip everything on the inside and jump to the back for all the fun stuff? I know most of these magazines have a history before and beyond just the 90s. So if you're someone that got to experience these magazines outside of the 90s, I'm curious to know how those versions were different compared to this specific era that I've covered today. Print media is often the subject of discussion about going extinct or at least becoming a novelty at best. But magazines are cool time capsules that give a view into things like social status and language among kids from the dying days of the modern era and 20th century popular culture. But I think the greatest gift a kids magazine could provide, at least from the perspective of wanting to read these back in the 90s myself, was the invaluable temporary escape it provided. Let's do the housekeeping part. Tell me which 90s magazine I criminally did not cover here today. I'm sure some of you will let me know. Please like the video if you enjoyed it and want to see more content like it. Subscribe to the channel, don't litter please, and I'll see you.